What if I told you? The people you trust, them will be the ones who try to take everything from you. The sun was setting over Lake Oliver, casting long golden shadows across my lawn. I sat alone on the porch, the same spot where my wife and I used to spend quiet evenings together. Back then, life felt full. Now it was just silency and memories. This house was never just a piece of property to me. It was my entire life. It was where I raised my daughter, Emily, where her laughter once filled every room, and where my wife's presence still lingers in every corner. But to my son-in-law, Mark, it was just a $1 million deal. The sun was setting over Lake Oliver, slowly dipping beneath the horizon as if it, too, was tired of the day. Its warm, golden light stretched across the lawn, painting everything in a soft glow that felt almost unreal. I sat quietly on the porch, in the same old chair that had carried the weight of so many evenings before. The wood beneath me creaked gently, a familiar sound that once brought comfort, but now only echoed the emptiness around me. The air was still, with only a faint breeze moving through the trees, whispering secrets I could no longer understand. There was a time when this hour of the day meant something entirely different. The evenings used to feel alive. My wife would sit beside me, her presence filling the silence with warmth that words could never fully capture. We didn't always need to talk. Sometimes we would just sit together, watching the sky change colors, sharing a quiet understanding that only comes from years of love and companionship. The world felt slower back then, softer, as if time itself respected the peace we had built together. Now, that peace had turned into something else, something heavier, the kind of silence that presses down on your chest and reminds you of everything you've lost. Every corner of this place seemed to hold a memory, and in moments like this, they all came rushing back at once. I could almost hear her laughter, drifting through the open windows, could almost feel the gentle touch of her hand resting on mine. But when I looked around, there was nothing there, just empty space and fading light. The porch, once a place of comfort, had become a front row seat to my loneliness. The shadows grew longer as the sun continued its descent, stretching across the yard like reminders of how much time had passed. Even the trees, tall and unmoving, seemed like silent witnesses to a life that had slowly slipped away. They had stood here long before me, and they would remain long after, watching as everything changed while they stayed the same. I let out a slow breath, my eyes fixed on the horizon as the last rays of sunlight began to disappear. There was something about sunsets that made everything feel more final, more real. It wasn't just the end of a day. It felt like the closing of a chapter, one that I wasn't ready to let go of. And yet, there I was, sitting in the fading light, holding on to memories that refused to fade, even as everything else around me quietly slipped into darkness. This house in Green Island Hills was never just a piece of property to me. It was the place where my entire life took shape, where every wall held a story and every room carried a memory. I didn't just live here. I built a life here, one day at a time, with the people who meant everything to me. From the moment we first stepped inside, it felt like more than a house. It felt like home in the truest sense of the word. I still remember the day we moved in. The rooms were empty, the floors echoing with each step, but there was excitement in the air. My wife walked from one room to another, already imagining where everything would go, her eyes filled with dreams and quiet determination. We didn't have much back then, but what we had was enough. We had each other, and that made those empty spaces feel full before a single piece of furniture was even placed. Over the years, those empty rooms transformed into something alive. The kitchen became the heart of the home, filled with the sound of laughter, the clinking of dishes, and the comforting aroma of meals shared together. The living room witnessed countless evenings of simple joy, family conversations, celebrations, and even the quiet moments when we sat together after a long day, finding peace in each other's presence. Every corner of the house slowly absorbed the rhythm of our lives. And then there was Emily. I watched her grow up within these walls, from a little girl taking her first steps across the wooden floor to a young woman chasing her own dreams. Her laughter used to echo through the hallways, light and carefree, filling the house with a kind of happiness which can't be bought or replaced. I remember the way she would run through the rooms, leaving behind a trail of energy and life that made this place feel complete. Every milestone of her life was tied to this house. Birthdays, school days, small victories, and even the quiet moments when she needed comfort. This home held more than just happy memories. It carried the weight of time, the changes, the challenges we faced as a family. It stood strong through every season of our lives, quietly holding us together even when things felt uncertain. And through it all, my wife was the soul of this place. Her presence turned it into something warm, something safe. Even now, I can still feel her here, in the way the light falls through the windows, in the stillness of the rooms, in the memories that refuse to fade. To anyone else, it might have looked like a beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood, but to me, it was everything. It wasn't measured in dollars or market value. It was measured in years of love, sacrifice, and moments that could never be replaced. Every inch of it was a reflection of the life we had built together, a life that still lived on within these walls, even as time tried to move forward without us. Mark came into our lives with confidence, the kind that makes people believe. He knows exactly what he's doing. From the outside, he seemed like the perfect match for Emily. Well-dressed, successful, always saying the right things at the right time. He carried himself like a man who had everything under control, someone who could provide stability and a secure future. And for a while, I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe my daughter had found someone who would take care of her the way I always hoped she would be cared for. In the beginning, he was respectful. He listened when I spoke, asked about my experiences, and even showed interest in the stories behind the house. He would walk through the rooms, nodding thoughtfully, as if he understood their meaning. But looking back now, I realize he wasn't seeing what I saw. He wasn't seeing the memories, the years, the life built within those walls. He was seeing something else entirely, something far more calculated. To him, this house wasn't a home. It was an opportunity. I started noticing it in small ways, the way his eyes would linger a little too long on certain details, the size of the land, the view of the hills, the structure of the property. The questions he asked weren't about the past, but about value. How old is the property? Has it been appraised recently? Do you know what homes in this area are going for now? At first, they seemed like casual curiosity, normal questions, but over time they began to feel different, colder. more intentional. While I spoke about memories, he spoke about members. While I remembered moments, he calculated worth. There was a disconnect. I couldn't fully explain at the time, but I could feel it. A quiet tension that sat beneath his polite smile. He would agree with everything I said, nod along, even compliment the house, but there was no emotion behind it, no understanding. It was like he was studying something instead of appreciating it. Emily, on the other hand, didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she chose not to. She was happy, and that was enough for me. I didn't want to question her choices or create doubt where there didn't seem to be any. So I stayed quiet, pushing aside the small unease that grew each time Mark looked at the house with that same distant, measuring gaze. As time passed, that feeling only became stronger. The more comfortable he got, the more obvious it became that his connection to his place was never emotional. He didn't walk through the rooms, remembering anything, because there was nothing for him to remember. He didn't sit on the porch and feel the silence, because to him, silence wasn't meaningful. It was empty space waiting to be filled with something profitable. And slowly, without saying it out loud, it became clear to me that while I saw a lifetime, Mark saw a price tag. After my heart surgery, everything in my life felt fragile, like I had been given a second chance, but with a quiet warning attached to it. The days moved slower, my body weaker than before, and even the simplest tasks required more effort than I was used to. It was during that time that Mark began to change, or at least that's how it appeared on the surface. He became more present, more attentive, stepping into spaces where he had once remained distant. At first, I appreciated it. I won't pretend I didn't. When you come out of something as serious as surgery, you begin to notice who shows up and who doesn't. Mark showed up. He called more often, checked in on me, and insisted on helping with things I would normally do myself. There was a calm confidence in the way he handled everything, like he was taking control of the situation, making sure nothing slipped out of place. He started taking me out, saying I needed fresh air and a change of scenery. We would drive into uptown Columbus, where the streets felt alive compared to the quiet stillness of my home. He'd choose the restaurants, order the food, and make sure everything was taken care of before I even had a chance to think about it. At times, it felt comforting to not have to worry about anything, to simply sit back and let someone else take charge. After dinner, he would suggest we take a walk along the Chattahoochee River Walk. The air there was always cooler, the sound of the water steady and calming. We would walk slowly, my steps measured, his pace adjusted to match mine. He'd point out the rushing current near Rush South Whitewater Park, talking about how powerful the water looked, how it never stopped moving forward. Sometimes he would relate it to life, saying things about letting go of the past, about not holding on to things that become too heavy over time. At the time, his words seemed thoughtful, caring even. He would talk about how managing a large estate at my age wasn't practical anymore, how it could become a burden rather than a comfort. He framed it as concern, as if he was looking out for my well-being, trying to make sure I didn't overwhelm myself. And slowly, without realizing it, I began to listen. There's something about vulnerability that changes the way you see people. When you're strong, you question things, you analyze, you stay cautious. But when you're recovering, When your body reminds you of your limits, you start to lean on others in ways you normally wouldn't. You trust more easily, not because you're careless, but because you want to believe that the people around you have your best interests at heart. Mark understood that. He never pushed too hard, never said anything that felt out of place. Everything he did was measured, controlled, carefully timed. His kindness didn't feel forced. It felt natural, almost effortless. And that's what made it so convincing. Looking back now, I realize it wasn't just kindness. It was strategy. A few days after one of those long, quiet walks, Mark came over again, this time carrying a thin leather folder tucked neatly under his arm. He didn't rush into anything. He made tea, asked how I was feeling, even adjusted the cushions behind my back, as if he had done it 100 times before. Everything about his presence felt calm, controlled, almost rehearsed. Then, at the right moment, he placed the folder gently on the table in front of me and slid it across with a reassuring smile. "These are just some documents for your long-term care," he said, his tone soft and confident, as if there was nothing in the world to question. I looked down at the papers. They were filled with dense text, legal language that blurred together the longer I stared at it. My eyes weren't what they used to be, and after the surgery, even focusing for too long made me tired. Mark noticed that. Of course he did. He leaned in slightly, pointing to certain lines, summarizing them in simple terms, breaking everything down so it sounded easy, harmless, necessary. He talked about security, about making sure I wouldn't have to worry about anything in the future, about having a plan in place so that if anything ever happened to me, everything would already be handled. His words were carefully chosen, each one designed to ease doubt before it could even form. I asked a few questions, but not enough, not the right ones, and every time I did, he had an answer ready, clear, confident, reassuring. "It's just a formality," he said at one point. "Something responsible people do." That sentence stayed with me. Responsible. At my age, after everything I had been through, I wanted to believe I was still capable of making responsible decisions. I didn't want to feel like a burden, like someone who needed to be managed or protected from his own life. Mark made it sound like this was my choice, my control, my way of taking charge of what came next. The pen felt heavier in my hand than it should have. I remember pausing for a moment, staring at the paper, something deep inside me hesitating, like a quiet voice, trying to say something I couldn't quite hear. But then I looked up at Mark. He nodded slightly, offering that same calm, steady smile. I trusted him. He was family, so I signed. One signature turned into another, page after page, line after line. The sound of the pen moving across the paper seemed louder than usual, each stroke echoing in the silence of the room. I didn't rush, but I didn't stop either. I kept going, believing I was doing the right thing. When it was done, Mark carefully gathered the papers, placing them back into the folder with a level of precision that felt almost too deliberate. He thanked me, his voice carrying a hint of satisfaction he didn't try to hide completely. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and told me everything was taken care of. Everything. I sat there for a while after he left, staring at the empty space where the folder had been. The house felt quieter than usual, heavier somehow, like something had shifted beneath the surface. I couldn't explain it. There was no clear reason to feel uneasy, No obvious sign that anything was wrong. And yet, deep down, something didn't feel right. But by then, it was already done. At first, the change was so subtle I almost convinced myself I was imagining it. A missed call here, a postponed visit there. Mark still spoke the same way, still carried that composed tone, but something underneath it had shifted. The warmth that once felt natural now seemed distant, like a performance slowly losing its energy. I told myself he was just busy. People have lives, responsibilities. It was easy to make excuses when you wanted to believe in someone. But then the small changes started adding up. The dinners we used to have together quietly disappeared. No more invitations to go out. No more casual conversations over a meal. The walks stopped too. Those long, slow evenings along the Chattahoochee Riverwalk, where he once spoke about life and letting go, became nothing more than a memory. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself sitting alone more often than not, staring at the same empty chair across from me. When he did show up, it wasn't the same. He was shorter with his words, less patient, like his time had suddenly become more valuable than mine. His visits felt rushed, purposeful. He wasn't there to talk anymore. He was there to check things, to look around, to make sure something invisible was moving in the direction he wanted. And then one day, I noticed something that I couldn't ignore. A car I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. Two men stepped out, dressed neatly, carrying folders and measuring tools. They weren't friends. They weren't family. They walked up to the house, like they belonged there, like they had a reason to be there that I wasn't aware of. Mark greeted them at the door with a firm handshake, speaking in a tone I had never heard before, professional, transactional. He didn't introduce me. He didn't explain anything. They walked through my home slowly, observing everything. The walls, the floors, the windows. One of them even took notes, occasionally glancing at me, as if I were just another object in the room. I stood there, trying to understand what was happening, waiting for Mark to say something, to acknowledge me, to give me some kind of explanation. But he didn't. Instead, he continued talking to them about square footage, structure, potential, words that had nothing to do with memories, nothing to do with the life that had been lived within those walls. To them, this wasn't a home, it was a project. That's when it hit me. The kindness hadn't faded by accident. It had served its purpose. Everything he had done, the care, the attention, the concern, it wasn't about me. It was never about me. It was about getting to a point where I would trust him enough to let my guard down, enough to sign without questioning, enough to step aside without resistance. And now that he had what he needed, there was no reason to pretend anymore. I looked around at the strangers walking through my house, touching things, measuring spaces, speaking in quiet, calculated voices. And for the first time, I felt like I didn't belong there anymore, like I had somehow become a guest in my own life. The realization didn't come with anger at first. It came with something heavier. A deep, sinking understanding that I had been fooled. The words didn't hit me all at once. "You have 3 days to pack." Mark said it so casually, like he was talking about the weather or a small errand that needed to be done. But those words lingered in the air, heavy and unreal, as if my mind refused to fully accept them. 3 days, that was all he had given me. 3 days to walk away from a lifetime. I stood there in silence, trying to process what he had just said. My eyes moved slowly around the room, taking in everything I had seen 1,000 times before, but now with a different weight. The walls felt closer, the space tighter, as if the house itself could feel what was happening. Every corner held a memory. Every object carried meaning, and now, somehow, all of it had been reduced to something that could be packed into boxes. I tried to speak, but the words didn't come easily. What do you say when someone tells you to leave your own life behind? There was no argument that seemed strong enough, no sentence that could undo what had already been set in motion. Mark had already made up his mind. I could see it in the way he stood, in the confidence of his posture, in the absence of any hesitation. To him this wasn't emotional. It was business. Emily was still standing in the doorway, her presence quiet but heavy. I looked at her, hoping for something, a word, a step forward, any sign that she would stop this. But she didn't move. Her eyes were filled with pain. Her face caught between two worlds she didn't know how to choose between. In that moment, I realized she was just as trapped as I was, but in a different way. She wasn't the one making the decision, but she wasn't stopping it either. The house felt different after that, not because anything had physically changed, but because the meaning behind it had shifted. I walked slowly from room to room later that day, letting my hand brush against the walls, the furniture, the small details that had once gone unnoticed. Each step felt heavier than the last. This wasn't just about leaving a place. It was about leaving behind pieces of myself that had been built over years. I opened drawers I hadn't touched in a long time, finding old photographs, letters, small keepsakes that carried moments frozen in time. Each item brought back something, a voice, a laugh, a feeling I thought I had already lived through. And now, I was expected to decide what to take and what to leave behind, as if memories could be sorted and chosen like objects. 3 days. It didn't feel like enough time to even begin, let alone finish. How do you pack a lifetime into such a short space? How do you walk away from something that has defined who you are for so long? That night I sat in the same chair on the porch, staring out into the darkness. The house behind me felt quieter than ever, almost like it was waiting, holding its breath along with me. Everything felt uncertain, unstable, like the ground beneath my feet had shifted without warning. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know where I belonged anymore. For a long time, I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to understand where it all went wrong. The papers, the visits, the sudden urgency, it all felt too deliberate to be coincidence. Mark had been careful, calculated, always one step ahead. And yet, something about the situation didn't sit right with me. There was a detail missing, something I hadn't fully considered at the time. I signed those documents. It started as a faint thought, almost easy to ignore. The original deed. This house had been in my possession for decades, passed down with conditions that were explained to me when I first acquired it. Back then, I hadn't paid much attention to the legal language. It felt like something distant, something that didn't really matter in the face of simply living my life. But now, that memory began to resurface, slowly pushing its way to the front of my mind. I found myself walking into the study, late one evening, long after the house had gone quiet. The room still held the same scent of old paper and polished wood, a place where time seemed to move more slowly. I opened the cabinet, where I had kept important documents over the years, my hands moving more carefully than usual, as if I already knew what I was looking for, but needed to confirm it. Inside, there were folders layered with age, each one holding pieces of the past I hadn't needed to revisit in years. My fingers traced over them until I found the one I hadn't touched in a very long time. It was worn, slightly faded, its edges softened by time. I pulled it out and placed it on the desk, pausing for a moment before opening it. There was something about that moment that felt different, important. As I unfolded the documents, the pages made a soft, brittle sound, like they were reminding me how long they had been waiting. The text was dense, written in formal language that demanded patience and focus. I adjusted my glasses and leaned closer, reading slowly, carefully, not wanting to miss a single detail this time. At first, it felt like everything I'd already known. Ownership details, boundaries, legal descriptions of the land, but then, deeper into the document I found it. A clause, small, almost hidden among the rest of the text, easy to overlook if you weren't paying close attention. My eyes stayed on those lines longer than anything else, reading them again and again, making sure I wasn't misunderstanding what was written there. And the more I read, the more everything began to make sense. This wasn't just a standard deed. It carried a condition, one that had been placed on the property decades ago, long before Mark had ever entered the picture. A restriction tied not just to ownership, but to presence, to the simple fact of me still being there. I leaned back slowly, the weight of the realization settling in. Mark had focused on the transfer, on the signatures, on the legal control he believed he had secured. But he hadn't looked far enough. He hadn't taken the time to understand the foundation beneath it all. And that one overlooked detail changed everything. In that quiet room, surrounded by the past he had tried to erase, I realized something for the first time since all of this began. I wasn't as powerless as he thought. The day of the final signing arrived with a strange kind of stillness, the kind that settles in before something changes for good. The house felt different that morning, quieter than usual, as if it already knew what was about to unfold. I moved slowly, more aware of each step, each breath, each passing moment. There was no rush in me anymore. No panic. Just a calm I hadn't felt since all of this began. When I walked into the study, the room was already filled. Mark stood near the table, confident as ever, speaking in low, controlled tones to the buyer. Papers were neatly arranged, pens placed carefully, everything set up for what he believed would be a simple, final transaction. The buyer looked eager, his attention focused on the documents in front of him, ready to complete the deal. No one noticed me at first, and for a brief moment I stood there, watching it all unfold as if I were looking at a scene I didn't belong in. My own home, my own life, being discussed and exchanged like it was just another agreement. But this time, something inside me didn't break. It steadied. I stepped forward, my presence finally drawing their attention. Mark turned, a hint of surprise crossing his face, quickly replaced by that familiar controlled expression. He wasn't worried. Not yet. To him, this was already done. The buyer reached for his pen. That was the moment. "Wait," I said, my voice calm but firm. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward me as I walked to the table, holding old, yellowed document in my hand. It didn't look like much, just age paper, worn by time, but in that moment, it carried more weight than everything else in that room combined. I placed it carefully on the table, the sound soft, but enough to shift the atmosphere. Mark's expression didn't change at first. He glanced at the document, then back at me, a faint smile forming, as if this was nothing more than a delay. "You were so focused on the price," I said quietly, meeting his eyes. "You forgot to read the fine print." The confidence on his face faltered, just slightly, but enough. I opened the document and pointed to the section he had overlooked, giving him no time to interrupt, no chance to control the moment like he had done before. My voice remained steady as I explained what was written there, each word clear, deliberate, impossible to ignore. The condition was simple. As long as I was alive and living in this home, the property could not be sold, not to him, not to anyone, and if anyone attempted to force a sale against that condition, the ownership wouldn't just fail. It would be forfeited entirely. I could feel the shift in the room as the meaning of those words settled in. The buyer's expression changed first. The eagerness disappeared, replaced by concern. He leaned closer to the document, reading it himself, his movements slower now, more cautious. The confidence he walked in with was fading with every second. Mark stepped forward, his voice sharper now, trying to regain control, to dismiss what I had said. But it was too late. The calm certainty he had built everything on was cracking piece by piece. The buyer straightened up, pulling his hand back from the papers. He didn't argue. He didn't question further. He simply understood what this meant. Without a word, he reached for his briefcase. The sound of it snapping shut echoed louder than anything else in that moment. And then he walked out, just like that. No deal, no $1 million. Nothing. The room fell into a heavy silence, thicker than anything I had felt before. Mark stood there unmoving, his face caught somewhere between anger and disbelief, as if he was still trying to process how everything had slipped through his hands. All his planning, all his control, gone in an instant, because of one thing he chose to ignore, and for the first time since this began, he had nothing left to say. After everything that happened, the house felt different again, but this time in a way I couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just relief, and it wasn't just exhaustion. It was something quieter, deeper, like a sense of stillness returning after a storm had passed. The same walls stood around me, the same rooms filled with the same memories, but now there was a new understanding beneath it all. Something that hadn't been there before. Mark was gone before the sun had fully set that day. There were no arguments left, no explanations, no final words that could undo what had already been revealed. Whatever he had hoped to gain had slipped through his hands, and with it, whatever place he once held in this home. The silence he left behind was heavy at first, but not in the same way as before. This time it didn't feel empty. It felt resolved. Emily stayed. Not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because sudden things couldn't be walked away from so easily. I could see it in her eyes. The guilt, the confusion, the weight of everything that had happened. She didn't try to justify anything, didn't offer excuses or explanations. Sometimes the damage is too deep for words to reach. But she was there, and in her own quiet way, that meant something. We didn't talk much in those first few days. We didn't need to. There are moments in life when silence carries more honesty than any conversation ever could. Slowly, though, that silence began to change. It became less about what had been lost, and more about what still remained. And little by little, something fragile began to rebuild between us, not the same as before, but real in its own way. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after that. It didn't need to. The mornings became my favorite part of the day. There was something peaceful about the early light, the way it filled the house, gently demanding anything in return. I started spending more time with my grandson, showing him things I once took for granted. We visited places like the Coca-Cola Space Science Center, where his eyes would light up at the sight of stars and planets, his curiosity endless and pure. In those moments, I was reminded that life continues, no matter what it takes from you. In the afternoons, I found comfort in quieter routines. Walks through Oxbow Meadows became a way to clear my mind, to reconnect with something simple and steady. The sound of nature, the feeling of the ground beneath my feet, the rhythm of each step, it all brought a kind of peace that couldn't be forced. And the house, it remained. Not as something I had to defend anymore, not as something under threat, but as something that simply was. It stood the same way it always had, rooted in time, carrying every memory, every moment, every piece of the life that had been built within it. It wasn't about ownership in the way Mark had seen it. It wasn't about value, price, or potential. It was about connection, about everything that couldn't be written into a contract or transferred with a signature. Some people look at a place and see what it's worth. Others look at it and see what it means. And that's the difference that can't be measured, because some things in life are held together by roots too deep to ever be pulled apart, no matter how hard someone tries. If this story touched your heart, stayed with you even for a moment, or reminded you of something personal, take a second to support the channel. Subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new story like this. Every story I share is meant to connect, to inspire, and to remind us of the things that truly matter in life. And your support helps me keep bringing these stories to you. So if you enjoyed this, hit subscribe, press the bell icon, and be part of this journey. It truly means more than you know.